And now it is my great pleasure to introduce the moderator of our first panel, Annemarie Jaeggi. She studied art history, classical archaeology, and history at the universities of Zurich and Freiburg im Breisgau. She received her PhD in art history from the University of Freiburg and her habilitation in 2001 on the subject of Walter Gropius and residential development in the Weimar Republic from the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology. She's held several visiting and deputy professorships in Germany, Switzerland, and France. And since 2003, as I'm sure you all know, she's the director of the Bauhaus Archive Museum of Design, Berlin, and honorary professor at the Institute of Art Studies of the University of Technology, Berlin. And it is a very great pleasure to welcome you again, Annemarie Jaeggi. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, and thank you for your very kind introduction, Florian Strob. It's a pleasure and also a real honor for me to introduce the speakers of the first panel. We are starting with Martino Stierli as the keynote speaker. He is the Philip Johnson Chief Curator of Architecture and Design at the Museum of Modern Art. As the Swiss National Science Foundation professor at the University of Zurich's Institute of Art History, Martino Stierli focused his research on architecture and media. His project, The Architecture of Hedonism, 3 Villas on the island of Capri, was included in the 14th Architecture Biennale in Venice. He has organized and co-curated exhibitions on a variety of topics, including the international traveling exhibition Las Vegas Studio, Images from the Archives of Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown. Martino Stierli's first monograph, Las Vegas in the Rearview Mirror, The City in Theory, Photography and Film, was published in 2010. He also authored a book on Robert Venturi's 2-year tenure at the American Academy in Rome in the mid-1950s and has published essays on topics including Mies van der Rohe's use of photomontage, the relationship between Dadaism and avant-garde architectural montage, modern architecture and urbanism in Brazil, and Rem Koolhaas's Delirious New York. He has written extensively on contemporary architectural practice. His scholarship has been recognized with a number of prizes, among them the ETH Medal of Distinction for Outstanding Research. Martino Stierli has taught at various Swiss universities, including the Universities of Zurich and Basel, as well as the ETH Zurich. May I now ask you, Martino Stierli, to come up on the stage. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Annemarie Jaeggi, and also heartfelt thank you to the Bauhaus Dessau Foundation in the person of Claudia Perren and also Florian Strob and his entire team for the perfect organization of this conference. I'm very glad to be here, especially in the warmth. Above everything else, the Bauhaus today stands for a phenomenal marketing and branding success. As this past year has made abundantly clear, the term Bauhaus is used, abused, and replicated ad nauseam to signify almost anything that is even remotely linked to what is commonly understood to be modern or modernist, and irrespective of whether the connection to the experimental design school that was the Bauhaus is ever so tenuous or even completely missing. Already in 1930, the Bauhaus still in place, the Hungarian artist Ernst Kallai bemoaned the triumph of this Bauhaus style, commenting ironically in the magazine Die Weltbühne, and I'm quoting Kallai, houses with lots of glass and shining metal, Bauhaus style. The same is true of home hygiene without home atmosphere, Bauhaus style. Tubular steel armchair frames, Bauhaus style. Lamps with nickel-coated body and disc of opaque glass and lampshade, Bauhaus style. Wallpaper patterned in cubes, Bauhaus style. No painting on the wall, Bauhaus style. Incomprehensible painting on the wall, Bauhaus style. Printing with sans serif letters and bold rules, Bauhaus style. Everything written in small letters, Bauhaus style. Everything written in capital letters, Bauhaus style. And Oskar Schlemmer in 1929 noted on the same matter, quote, "This style can be found everywhere but at the Bauhaus." Indeed, for a pedagogical experiment that was relatively short-lived, consistently underfunded, commercially mildly successful, highly controversial and under increasing pressure from the political right, the Bauhaus has proven an astonishing longevity. It has been noted, and I would tend to agree with this view, that paradoxically, it was precisely the precarious history of the actual Bauhaus and its protagonists, a history that in many ways mirrors that of the 20th century more broadly, that provided the grounds for the Bauhaus's remarkable afterlife. The Bauhaus itself was, of course, itinerant, both as an institution and an idea, starting out in the relative backwater of Weimar and moving on to Dessau and Berlin before conquering, through the agency of its members and disciples, the metropolitan centers of New York, Moscow, Chicago, and Mexico City. This double involuntary migration from the alleged peripheries to the centers of power, and generally from east to west, is tout court a parable of the 20th century. In recent years, we have become increasingly aware of the global presence of the Bauhaus's afterlife. Nevertheless, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which is the topic of my lecture today, continues to hold a special place in this narrative. From MoMA's early beginnings under the visionary directorship of Alfred Barr, whom you see here as a young man, the institution has conceptualized and branded itself after the image of the Bauhaus as an interdisciplinary laboratory at the intersection of contemporary art, design, and everyday life. Today, MoMA's collection is considered one of the leading repositories of Bauhaus works. However, I would contend that neither MoMA's myth of origin nor the formation of its collection were a linear and straightforward process, and further, that the complicated transformation of the legacy of an experimental art school into a leading museum of modern art is evidenced in the provenance histories of many objects in the museum's collections originating at the Bauhaus. Let me start out with a brief summary of how the Bauhaus idea came to MoMA. Alfred Barr, the museum's foundational director, took a keen interest in the art school and its principles even before he traveled there for the first time in 1927. As early as 1926, and while still a graduate student at Harvard University, he started teaching a class on modern art at Wellesley College. This class is widely considered the first of its kind in the United States. Not only was Barr's embrace of the contemporary unusual within the context of an art history course, his interdisciplinary approach that included not only painting and sculpture, but also architecture, industrial design, graphic art, photography, and even film was truly revolutionary in the context of its time. Barr would later maintain that MoMA's multi-departmental plan reflected, quote, simply the subject headings of the Wellesley course. Barr had first familiarized himself with the Bauhaus mission by reading the catalogue of the 1923 exhibition Staatliches Bauhaus in Weimar, as well as several of the 14 Bauhaus Bücher, which were published from 1925 onward. The interdisciplinary organization of the Bauhaus provided Barr with a structural model for how to envision a museum of modern art when he was appointed its director. As he wrote in a letter to A. Conger Goodyear, the first president of the museum's board of trustees, and I'm quoting Barr from that letter, "I read particularly about the Bauhaus, a fabulous institution, painting, graphic arts, architecture, the crafts, typography, theater, cinema, photography, industrial design for mass production, all were studied and taught together in a large modern building. Later, in 1927, I visited the Bauhaus for several days. Undoubtedly, it had an influence not only upon the plan for the museum, but also upon a number of its exhibitions." And when Barr was awarded an honorary doctorate from Princeton University in 1949, he again referenced the Bauhaus as an inspiration for MoMA's multi-department structure. Reality, of course, proved more complicated than that. Indeed, it is perhaps not immediately evident how the organizational structure of an experimental art school could serve as a blueprint for a museum of art. What proved equally complicated was that Barr's bold vision was not entirely congruent with what the founders of this private museum had in mind. MoMA came about through the initiative of a group of 3 wealthy collectors, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, Lily Bliss, and Mary Quinn Sullivan, who you see projected here, whose interest lay less with contemporary design and more with painting, and in particular French post-impressionism of the late 19th century and early 20th century, including the work of Paul Cézanne, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Edgar Degas, or Georges Seurat. And I'm showing you here 2 of the paintings that came into the collection through the bequest of Lily Bliss, one of the founding figures of the museum. These paintings are equally the beginning of the collection of the museum. Whereas Barr had envisioned from the beginning an institution that would include departments of design, architecture, furniture, photography, stage design, typography, and film, the Board of Trustees was less enthusiastic about this all-encompassing vision. Thus, Barr's vision was pared down considerably in the official communication to the public on the occasion of the opening in the museum in 1929, and the communication read as follows, quote, "In time, the museum will expand beyond the limits of painting and sculpture in order to include departments devoted to drawings, prints, and other phases of modern art." End quote. It took, as David Hanks has argued, considerable perseverance on Barr's part over the following decades to implement his vision of a multidisciplinary and multi-departmental institution with separate departments of architecture, industrial arts, photography, and film being established within the first decade of the museum's existence. A further important moment of the absorption of the Bauhaus into the museum's DNA was the 1938 exhibition devoted to the Bauhaus, which had been closed by then for 5 years. The organizers of the show, Walter and Ise Gropius, as well as Herbert Bayer, had in the meantime, like many other former Bauhäusler, emigrated to the United States, where many of them would take on important positions in key institutions and thereby not only fundamentally transform artistic and architectural pedagogy, but also prepare the grounds for the institutionalization of modernism in the post-war period. While the 1938 exhibition featured a very innovative exhibition design by Bayer that related back to the Bauhaus experiments, it was met with mixed reviews by the American audience. Nevertheless, the exhibition was seminal in that it assembled for the first time a large group of Bauhaus-related objects in New York, many of which would later enter the museum's collection in straightforward or more oblique ways, more of which later. The show thus substantiated Barr's intellectual aspiration with exemplars of modernist material culture with, as we know, transformative consequences for post-war visual culture, industrial production, and everyday life in America and elsewhere. It could be said then that by means of a preliminary conclusion, that Barr's vision of implementing the multidisciplinary structure of the Bauhaus and the radical de-hierarchization and democratization even of applied and fine arts that ensued from its foundational principles was first and foremost aspirational and took considerable time toward a partial, if not full, implementation. This intersection of aspiration with pragmatic reality is reflected in the history of the collection as well, where many works of art, including those originating from the Bauhaus and its members, were inserted into the museum's collection through the back door or with considerable delay. This brings me to the second part of my paper, where I would like to now look more specifically at how MoMA became one of the prime collections and repositories of the Bauhaus legacy. If, as we have seen, the Bauhaus was an essential part of MoMA's origin myth and Barr's vision for this newly founded institution, various factors both within the institution and without threatened or at least delayed the implementation of this vision. While internal factors for this delay can be seen in the resistance on the part of the Board of Trustees, who had a more conservative vision for the structure of the museum and its collection, external factors mainly centered around the political situation in Germany after the Nazi takeover and the dramatic consequences that ensued from it for many members of the Bauhaus. Consequences of this political situation for MoMA were ambiguous. While on the one hand, the museum was faced with the forced demise of the institution that had served as its inspiration, on the other hand, there can be no doubt that, in fact, MoMA profited considerably from the influx of Bauhäusler émigrés to the United States. And more, that the political situation in Nazi Germany even provided an opportunity to collect works of art and objects that would not have been available on the market otherwise. In the following, I will discuss a small sample of case studies that exemplify the Bauhaus-MoMA transfer. More than merely recounting anecdotes, I believe these microhistories allow us to understand better the complexities and ambiguities that surround the provenance of many of these objects. Not all of these provenance microhistories are equally stunning, as the history or as the story how the first two paintings by the Russian suprematist painter Kazimir Malevich entered into MoMA's collection. And while this story does not directly relate to the Bauhaus at all, Malevich, of course, was never associated with the school, it is nevertheless telling and helpful to understand the situation under which the collection strategy of the early MoMA unfolded, which will in turn shed light also on the conditions by which Bauhaus-related objects entered the collection. In 1935, Barr traveled to Germany in order to research in order to conduct research connected to his seminal Cubism and Abstract Art exhibition, which would open its doors in the following year as the museum's first large thematic show. Here the very famous diagram of the isms of art that formed the cover image of the exhibition catalog for Cubism and Abstract Art. One of the places that Barr visited on this occasion was the Provinzialmuseum Hanover, where Alexander Dorner had been director since 1925 and had used his tenure to establish the museum as one of the foremost collections of avant-garde art in Germany. For example, housing L. Lissitzky's famous Kabinett der Abstrakten in 1927-28, a truly innovative, dynamic, and interactive gallery for the display of contemporary avant-garde art. In 1925, Dorner had unsuccessfully attempted to acquire works by Malevich through Lissitzky. Malevich traveled from Leningrad to Germany in 1927 in order to participate in the Große Berliner Ausstellung of that year, bringing some 70 works along. And I'm showing you here an installation view of the 27 exhibition. He was forced to return home to Leningrad before the end of the exhibition and left the paintings and drawings that were on view in the care of the architect Hugo Hering. Hering in turn transferred Malevich's works to the care of Dorner, who exhibited them in Hanover until the Nazi takeover, when he placed them in storage in order to save them from possible destruction. Malevich did not have a chance to collect the works before his death in 1935 and did not leave any instructions as to what was to happen to the works. Barr benefited from this situation in his 1935 visit to Hanover, when Dorner offered to sell to MoMA 2 paintings and 2 drawings for $200, as well as to loan 17 other drawings. It is worth noting that this purchase belonged to the first ever made on behalf of the Museum of Modern Art, as Alfred Barr had received a $1,000 check from Abby Aldrich Rockefeller in preparation of his trip. While Dorner shipped the majority of the works to New York as, quote, technical drawings, Barr crossed the border with the 2 paintings he had acquired wrapped around his umbrella and several drawings hid in magazines in order to bring the works out of the country unnoticed. The 2 paintings brought to New York in the umbrella in this way were Suprematist Composition, Airplane Flying from 1915, and Untitled Suprematist Painting from 1916. While this story may sound like an urban legend, it is proudly recounted in the museum's official press release from 1942, announcing the formal acquisition of these works into the collection. The case was settled legally for good in 1999 when MoMA made a cash payment to Malevich's 35 living descendants for the works. A similar story of an opportunistic purchase facilitated directly by the Nazi takeover had occurred a couple of years earlier, and in this instance there is a clear Bauhaus connection. In 1933, the year that Hitler came to power, Barr traveled again extensively through Europe in the company of his wife, Margaret Scolari Barr, in order to recover from a nervous condition. Museum work is exhausting after all. On this occasion, the Barrs visited the monographic show dedicated to Oskar Schlemmer that had opened at the Württembergischer Kunstverein in Stuttgart on March 1st of that year. When they returned to the show a couple of weeks later, it had been closed due to a condemning review in the local Nazi press. Barr was allowed to see the now dismounted works and spotted Schlemmer's monumental masterpiece, Die Bauhaus Treppe, which he had painted in 1932, again in direct response to the decree ordering the closure of the Bauhaus Dessau in August of that year. It is here that Barr's long-term associate, Philip Johnson, enters the stage. The 2 of them had first met in 1929 and bonded immediately. Barr would subsequently invite Johnson to organize the first exhibition of modern architecture at the museum and install him in 1932 as the first director of the Department of Architecture, the first of its kind anywhere in a museum of modern art. Johnson was also independently wealthy and provided an ideal vehicle in order not only to account for the absence of an acquisition budget on Barr's part, but also to circumvent potential resistance from the Board of Trustees against such potentially contentious super-contemporary art. In this situation, Barr telegraphed Johnson proposing to buy Schlemmer's painting, quote, just to spite the sons of bitches, as he would later say, referencing the Nazis and their campaign against modern and avant-garde art. Johnson was happy to step in and acquire the painting for his own personal collection, with the understanding that it would later enter the museum's collection. And we see the painting here hanging in Johnson's apartment on 49th Street, where it was proudly on view after 1934. It now hangs in the so-called Bauhaus stair of the original Goodwin and Stone building of the MoMA campus, with the modeling of the MoMA building after the Bauhaus, another case in point that cannot be discussed here in detail. The Balustrade painting was the first of many European artworks that Barr would save before World War II. And the fact that it depicted life at the Bauhaus, as well as one of its most iconic spaces, was emblematic for the narrative that MoMA would construct for itself as the heir of the school's legacy. It is, of course, not without irony that it was Philip Johnson, of all people, who would become a savior of modern art from Nazi Caesar, precisely in a moment when his fascination with fascist politics and the Führer cult became more and more apparent, and as he would embark in 1934 on a decade-long misguided journey into the dark corners of right-wing fascist and populist politics. As for Barr, he and his wife, the experience of the closed-down exhibition, as well as their visit to Schwirr's Märzbau in his hometown Hanover after the artist had already been forced to leave for Norway, proved seminal. As Leah Dickerman has argued, the impact of these experiences on Barr was clear, prompting him to, quote, commit to a rescue project to salvage modern art, threatened or jettisoned from Europe, and ultimately to save artists too. While Schlemmer's painting didn't arrive at MoMA until 1942, the works of other ostracized artists such as Lisitsky, Malevich, or Schwirr's was prominently featured in the Cubism and Abstraction exhibition, thus paving the way for their canonization in modern art history. What the 1936 exhibition did for Cubist and abstract art was to some degree repeated 2 years later for Bauhaus-related work in the already mentioned 1938 survey exhibition. The political situation in Germany made it difficult to find and export original works, not only for practical reasons, but also because many Bauhäusler who had remained in Germany feared retribution by the Nazis. In his preface to the catalogue, Barr maintained that, quote, under existing conditions in Germany, it was not possible to bring more actual objects to this country for the exhibition. End quote. Instead, the exhibition relied considerably on large-scale photography by Lucia Moli, however, without crediting her, in order to supplement the objects on view, which I think is evident in these installation views from the 1938 exhibition. As far as the collection is concerned, it is interesting to note that in 1957, some 20 years later, in a letter signed by the MoMA design curator Greta Daniel to Josef Albers, she bemoaned the fact that the architecture and design collection at that time featured a mere 18 Bauhaus objects in total. This realization in the following 2 years led to a systematic effort on part of the museum to expand its Bauhaus holdings, led primarily by Daniel's outreach to Bauhäusler in the United States and Europe, which resulted in the acquisition of a significant number of Bauhaus-related objects. Many of these came into the collection directly from the architects and designers, but some were donated by one Bauhäusler donating a work by another, for example, Gropius gifting a poster by Jost Schmidt. The paucity of Bauhaus design objects in MoMA's collection up to the late 1950s can be explained again by the political situation in Europe and by the fact the Bauhaus exhibition took place in 1938 and thus only months before the outbreak of World War II. This fact made it practically impossible to return many of the works that had been assembled for the exhibition to the artists and lenders in Europe. While not formally acquired into the collection, the museum kept an inventory of works from the exhibition and started to return them whenever possible after the end of the war. A particularly interesting case in point are several metal objects by Marianne Brandt, including a teapot and 2 bowls that you can see here. In a letter by Brandt to exhibition co-organizer Herbert Bayer from 1937, Brandt agreed to loan 4 objects in total, however explicitly mentioning that she was not willing to donate or sell them to the museum. This is the letter by Brandt to Herbert Bayer. I'm quoting in German. Es sind meine einzigen Exemplare, an Verkauf kann ich also gar nicht denken. Allenfalls könnten die Schalen als Muster für Fabrikation gebraucht werden, doch müsste ich auch dann die Muster selbst zurückhaben. Die Schalen, die ich für Amerika geben würde, sind aber meine letzten Originale. Ende Zitat. As part of curator Greta Daniel's efforts in the late 1950s to acquire more Bauhaus materials for the collection, she successfully contacted Marianne Brandt in Germany and in an internal memo acknowledged that she had visited the artist and paid for the 4 objects that were still held in the museum's storage, as well as for a couple of additional objects, namely a water jug and a lamp. Because Brandt was living in East Berlin, her sister Susanne Laffeld acted as intermediary for the financial transaction. In a letter written to Daniel in October 1957, Laffeld stated, quote, Mrs. Brandt lives in the German Democratic Republic, that is, the communist section of Germany. Many topics, such as payment in foreign currency, etc., would make direct correspondence dangerous to life and freedom in the Eastern Zone. End quote. Whether this characterization of the situation in East Berlin some 4 years before the construction of the Berlin Wall is adequate is not a matter of discussion here. However, the episode is indicative of the complexities that the rupture of World War II brought about in the establishment of a Bauhaus collection at MoMA, and that a sustained research effort over many years and even decades was necessary in order to arrive at the current collection. An extreme case in a delayed officialization of an acquisition concerns the Hungarian architect Farkas Molnár. After having first trained in graphic design and painting in his native city Pécs in southern Hungary, Molnár came to work in Gropius's architecture studio, which was attached to the Bauhaus Weimar. Molnár's most significant project of the Bauhaus period was the Red Cube House, which he designed in conjunction with Gropius's efforts to direct research toward the creation of a prototype for prefabricated houses in the context of the 1923 Bauhaus exhibition. Molnár's project, that you can see here, was not realized, with the internal jury instead selecting Georg Muche's proposal. However, Molnár's scheme remained a reference for years to come, featuring prominently in the 1938 Bauhaus exhibition at MoMA, next to projects by Walter Gropius and Marcel Breuer. Even though the project was only represented in black and white in the exhibition catalogue, you see it here on the top left, the project remained widely known. The original drawing, however, one of a total of 11 objects that Molnár had lent to the exhibition, went astray. Molnár's tragic death in the waning days of the war during the siege of Budapest remained unknown to the MoMA curators, who tried without success to contact him after the war. It is unclear why the drawing was lost in the museum's storage, but it was only rediscovered by accident in 2012. At this time, MoMA successfully identified Farkas Molnár's daughter Eva in Budapest, who agreed to sell it to the museum. And the drawing is currently on view in our reconfigured collection galleries in the new and expanded MoMA, which opened this past October. If the MoMA drawings present something of a happy end to one of the more usual provenance microhistories of Bauhaus objects in the MoMA collection, I would like to come to a conclusion by myself with this episode. Needless to say, there would be many other stories to tell, including, for instance, the significant acquisition of the Mies van der Rohe archive following his death in 1969. This acquisition included all the remaining documents from the architect's German period, which were held in storage in East Germany until they were finally released to Mies in 1963. Who, of course, was by then living in Chicago. As I believe my presentation today has made sufficiently clear, the self-projected image of MoMA as the legitimate heir to the Bauhaus principles and of its material cultures was one that the museum's initial director Alfred Barr had perhaps envisioned from the outset, but that in reality took many years or decades and the perseverance of many to be fully accomplished. The fact that the Bauhaus progeny could move beyond Barr's aspirations was indebted to a unique historical situation which Barr and his allies were able to benefit from, establishing the Museum of Modern Art firmly within the Bauhaus legacy. Thank you very much.